Just watched a clip from the Australian documentary program 60 Minutes, which was both very frustrating but also very revealing. It was an interview by Tara Brown with Professor Chen Hong of the Australia Centre in Shanghai. Professor Chen Hong is a research fellow who contributes to the controversial Jingoistic party mouthpiece Global Times. Now, Global Times recently responded to an Australian inquest for an independent inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 by describing the great nation of Australia as chewing gum on China's boot that needs to be scraped off. This is not the first time that Global Times has come out with a jingoistic rant. It's a nasty, nasty publication, and I'm not at all surprised by that. But what's quite revealing is during this interview, when she made the quotation, Professor Hong actually smirked. He thought it was funny. And he tried to downplay it by claiming it was metaphorical only. Then he got on the defensive, saying that the call for an independent inquiry was unfair on China. Well, there's a few things that are notable about this. For quite a long time, Chinese diplomacy has been relatively polite, at least outwardly. But when you look a little bit beneath the surface, what I mean by that is officially leading members of the Communist Party are relatively diplomatic. They will, on state visits, for example, they will praise the host nation. When they came to Britain, they were quite polite, quite complimentary. Um, they described us as the world's first industrialized country. So they're not stupid. They have enough pragmatism to be diplomatic when they choose. But what's notable is this is probably the biggest test for Xi Jinping's tenure. Make no mistake about it, the last year and a half, Xi Jinping's weaknesses have been greatly exposed. I mean, it's easy to look at this as the great overbearing Chinese dragon, but actually, we've seen a lot of Chinese weakness with this, and we've seen the personal weakness of Xi Jinping in his handling of this. It shows a party that's actually very nervous. Um, And I think that's significant because when the Chinese Communist Party is put into a corner like a dog, it barks, it bites back. Um, and they lash out with insults. They describe Australia as chewing gum on their shoe. They've um, ranted about Canada being prone to white supremacy. And what was their motivation for doing that? For no other reason than Ottawa um, requested to know about the welfare of its two nationals being held in China on trumped up charges. So we really, really need to see what's going on here. And there's a simple question. If the Chinese Communist regime really is confident that they've handled this as best they can, that they've been transparent, which is just laughable. Professor Hong claims that China has been transparent. I mean, all communist officials are liars, and this guy is a stooge of the Communist Party, so, lies come with that, because the only thing they care about is saving face. So it's laughable, and no one outside China is really going to believe that, except perhaps a few China stooges. I mean, we have a few Western apologists for the Chinese regime, but it's very, very obvious that China has been anything but transparent during this crisis. They certainly weren't transparent in the beginning when they punished doctors who were doing their job. Um, and even if you want to dismiss that and say it was only a short time and then they went on to quarantine Wuhan, those were critical weeks, those opening weeks. But they have not been transparent since then with other countries. And bear in mind, this independent inquiry is being pushed from the World Health Organization. Now, you might say that America and Australia and Western nations are behind the calls for this to happen, but what I would say is that if China has nothing to hide, if the Chinese government has nothing to hide, what have they got to fear? Simple as that. This would not be tolerated with any other country on earth. If there was a huge cover up at the hands of the United Kingdom or France or Japan or any other country, it wouldn't be allowed to stand. And frankly, the international community need to wake up and see China's rogue behavior on the international stage. This is a pandemic that the whole world is dealing with. 28,000 of my compatriots have died, almost 29,000. So I'm angry. I'm very angry. And if you're not angry with China, at least to some extent, then you're not paying attention. And I have to say, with the greatest respect, 60 Minutes, and I do think it's a good news source. I think they do their homework. I'm not sure what the point is of interviewing communist stooges because they're always going to lie. I mean, I guess it's useful to kind of get into their way of thinking, but it certainly won't build any bridges. You know, they're never going to apologize because that's not in the Chinese psyche to apologize. They never do. They're too arrogant to do that. By Chinese, I'm talking about the Chinese regime, obviously. Um, so I'm disgusted by the fact that it's adding insult to injury. They've imposed this pandemic on the world. It's all very well saying like the enemy is the virus, and it is, you know. I can go so far as to accept they didn't deliberately create the virus to impose on the world, but their cover up of this, the lack of transparency, the sheer arrogance in refusing to admit any culpability for this, all of that really damns China's legacy in terms of its handling of this. And I still think that we are far, far too passive in our response. I mean, yes, the priority needs to be dealing with this on our own backyard, i.e., doing what we need to do, getting the tests, um, making sure people abide by the regulations, easing pressure on health systems. All those things are the absolute priority, even above standing up to China. But standing up to China is a very, very close second. Because if we come out of this and nothing changes, and we continue pandering to Beijing, I will not only be furious, I will be utterly disheartened because it will just show that our government haven't learned a thing. And right now, of the Five Eyes nations, I would say Britain's the weakest in terms of our attitude to China. We're just too passive. We're sitting on the fence. We are just not doing enough. There is growing calls from British media, I'm pleased to see, and I have a lot of respect for Tom Turgenhat and his committee, but so much more needs to be done. I'm disgusted with Ofcom, to be quite honest. I've said this before, but it's worth reiterating because Ofcom has the power to strip a network of its license to operate in this country. Now, why will they not do that? Why? It just doesn't make sense that they continue to allow CGTN to promote propaganda on our shores. That's an insult. It's an insult to our national sovereignty. And the same applies to RT, but I'll I'll stick to one opponent for one video. Um, the sheer arrogance of these communist officials is sickening. But even if you want to turn a blind eye to all the massive human rights abuses that are taking place in China, the massive concentration camps in Xinjiang, even if you want to turn a blind eye to all of that, what we have seen now is that Chinese totalitarianism has had a direct impact on the rest of the world. Now, the World Health Organization, I do believe, was compromised. I do believe it sold out to Beijing too much under the leadership of Tedros Adhanom. But I don't think it's too late. I think if the international community really, really, and I'm not just talking about Western countries, I'm talking about other Asian countries as well. I'm talking about every country that cares about its sovereignty in terms of how that is impacted by Chinese totalitarianism. Smaller countries that are relying on China um, sympathize with them more than bigger countries that are appeasing China because those smaller countries don't have much choice. It's economic bullying in a way. It's kind of blackmail. China gives them resources, and it's a bit like what Russia does actually with the gas pipelines to Europe. I'd say this Belt and Road Initiative is kind of the Chinese equivalent. And I'll say this, I don't think it's really necessary, but I'll say it anyway. Um, I'm not xenophobic in the sense that I am not against China, the country, against the Chinese people. And I could say that all day. I know what I feel about it. I'm really, really not against the Chinese people. But if the Chinese people, or those individual Chinese people who want to defend the regime, want to do that in other countries, they want to bring their jingoism to other countries, then we need to frankly get more assertive. Put simply, I think we are far too tolerant of China's China's behaviour, and it is really, really frustrating when I see some on the left try to dismiss this as a racist thing. I mean, why is it that when in the 1930s, when we opposed the Third Reich, that wasn't seen as racist? You could argue because Germans were white Europeans, but when we opposed Russia in the Cold War and more recently, that wasn't seen as racist. So why is it racist suddenly because, well, the Chinese happen to be of a different ethnicity? I think that should be a void argument because we can work very closely with Japan, with South Korea, with Taiwan, with a lot of other countries in that region. So when some on the left try to make this a racist thing, it is immensely frustrating because that just stands as a barrier to scrutinizing what is going on here. We shouldn't oppose China and the Chinese government because they're Asians. We should oppose them because they're a belligerent force, because they're a dishonest and deceptive force. Because Chinese totalitarianism is having a direct consequence on the rest of the world. Even if you think that's hyperbole, consider the sheer jingoism coming from their media. I mean, it's quite ironic that there's a lot of focus on the so-called Sinophobia in the West, but look at the Western phobia from Chinese media. It's rampant. It's everywhere. You go to Chinese social media and it's full of praise for the Chinese government and full of critique of Western media. I mean, that's what's happening. And you can look at it this way: either China as one country is correct, or the mounting number of countries that are getting critical of China's attitude and its behavior are wrong. So you either consider that the majority might be right or an individual country might be right. The few countries that do back China do so solely because of their trade relations. Pakistan's a notable example, and there's a couple of others. But really, I would like to see the Communist Party isolated. I'm not calling necessarily for punishment, but I would like to see them isolated. The only reason I wouldn't call for punishment necessarily is because I'm not sure it's the most practical thing, but I absolutely, absolutely believe that we must pull off relations. It's not something I say lightly. I still have contact with my Chinese friends, and it really is the definition of between a rock and a hard place, because this is not something I would bring up with them. If they brought it up, I won't self-censor. I'm not going to lie to them about how I feel about this. But, it's it's a question of personal feelings versus truth. So my personal friendship is very important, but so is truth. So is truth. And at its core, the Chinese Communist Party has an antipathy to truth. So we really need to be a lot more vocal on this because it's such a British trait. This is a great country, but one thing I think that we need to be more assertive about is recognizing a problem when it is happening. Too often in this country, we wait until the last minute. I mean, look at the years of appeasement to the Third Reich. And I'm not saying that Xi Jinping's China is the Third Reich. I'm not suggesting for a second they're about to start a world war. I don't think they are. That's not my position. But it is a totalitarian regime. And we are still, I fear, playing this game of caution. We are still, I fear, My biggest concern about coronavirus actually is that we will come out of this and get back to normal in a geopolitical sense and get back to normal relations with Beijing as they were before, which was not friendship, it was not allied, but it was frankly apathetic. You know, the security services have been warning the government for a long time, and frankly, the Johnson administration's ignored it. The Johnson administration has not come across as strong on China. The May administration again was somewhat lackluster. The Cameron administration was outright um, appeasing China, as was the Brown, Blair, Major administrations. Well, okay, to give Major his due, his administration did give a thawing of relations after Tiananmen Square, as did the closing year of the Thatcher administration. But basically, our six premiers since then have really not stood up to China the way they should have done. And this is not about, muscle flexing. It's not about just trying to look tough for the sake of it. It's about the truth and it's about being assertive to what is going on here. If I was the Prime Minister, and it's easy to say that, but if I was, I would be a lot more vocal than Johnson is. And I'm afraid it's, I'm not overly inspired by his response so far. I think it's been quite lackluster. Um, and I know now you might say now is not the right time. So yes, the absolute priority is getting us out of coronavirus, but I do want to see him being more vocal in terms of how we approach Beijing. When China insults Australia, they're insulting Britain, they're insulting Canada, they're insulting every Western democracy. That principle should apply because it's shared values. And I take no pleasure from any of this. I wish we had good relations with China, but the nature of this regime has made that impossible. Never ever forget this is something that China imposes on the world, not the other way around.